Hello, my name is Sebastian Bustamante and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Bristol, researching digital memories from Latin America. In this episode of the Remembering Objects podcast, I'd like to take you on a journey with an object as our guide. I'll present 3 vignettes and histories related to artistic production during the dictatorship in Chile between 1973 and 1990. I look at how a humble milk container tells the story of the fall of the brutal Augusto Pinochet dictatorship, which ruled Chile for 17 years through violence. This podcast will discuss protest, cultural production, and the importance of artists in moments of political change. Please note, this episode contains descriptions of violence and suicide. 1. I'm looking at the photograph of a creased plastic bag on my computer screen. The material is white, and stencilled on it are the bold words medio litro de leche, half a litre of milk, and Papá, tengo hambre, Dad, I am hungry. Finally, written in biro pen at the bottom of the bag, are the words por un mundo mejor, for a better world. Barely legible printed writing and the inverted word Suprole are just about visible. Suprole is a Chilean dairy company. The webpage I'm looking at is from the Museo de la Memoria y de los Derechos Humanos, a memory museum. The object I'm looking at is one of the collection's objects showcased on the organisation's website. The site uses digitised reproductions of museum objects to tell the individual stories of the civic military dictatorship in Chile. An accompanying text on the museum's website tells visitors that this object belongs to an art action called Para no morir de hambre en el arte, so as not to starve to death in art, by the group CADA, Colectivo Acciones de Arte, the Art Actions Collective. This object is the documentation related to an art action by CADA, a group of scholars, artists and writers. The group made socially engaged artworks which challenged censorship and spoke out against violence in the country at the height of the dictatorship. The country is still dealing with the legacies of the dictatorship today, more than 50 years after a violent coup brought an end to the world's first democratically elected socialist government. The socialist Salvador Allende was elected on a popular platform with working class support in 1970, winning by a small margin. This period in Chile was marked by political upheaval as the country's right wing, dismayed by Allende's election, would conspire to bring an end to his government. Leftist groups would demand more radical change from Allende, leading to increased instability, and Allende found it increasingly difficult to manage the social and political upheavals of the time. The period was one of increased tension between left and right. In the 3 years of his government, Allende would see his aims significantly challenged by national strikes, congressional mutinies, and also by the rise of right-wing militia partially funded by the CIA to destabilise his government. On the 11th of September 1973, the coup that the government had long feared was underway. Allende woke early to reports that there was a navy mutiny in the port city of Valparaiso, and he headed to the presidential palace that morning. A previous coup attempt on the 29th of June 1973 had been successfully halted. This new putsch, with all branches of the armed forces involved, succeeded where the first attempt failed. The late addition of a careerist general, recently appointed head of the army, Augusto Pinochet, was vital in securing the overthrow of Allende. On the 11th of September, the Chilean Air Force's British-supplied Hawker Hunter jets would fly by the presidential palace in downtown Santiago and would eventually fire rockets at the presidential palace, whilst Allende and his close entourage perilously tried to defend the palace. Allende would deliver his last speech from the palace, before he would then ask his staff to leave the building as it was ablaze. Allende would take to the Independence Suite of the palace and would place the barrel of his AK-47 rifle in his mouth and pull the trigger. Allende was dead, and now nothing stood in the way of the military junta seizing absolute control of the country. Augusto Pinochet would seize power of the country and enforce a state of exception with curfews and arrests of those deemed enemy of the state. Former supporters of Salvador Allende, leftists, communists and socialists were all rounded up and put in clandestine detention centres across the country. Expressions of rebellion or dissent to the new military order were met with violent retribution. Thousands were arrested and forced to flee the country, as my parents were in 1974. The dictatorship was characterised by political persecution, torture, killings and enforced disappearances. But what about the milk container? The object I looked at on the Memory Museum's website is documentation related to this socially engaged artwork Para no morir de hambre en el arte, so as not to starve to death in art, in which members of the art collective went to a poor neighbourhood in the capital city of Santiago de Chile called La Granja and gave out free milk. This act was done in memory of Salvador Allende's policy to give malnourished children half a litre of milk a day. Some free milk provision had been in place since the 1950s in Chile. The military regime ended these programs as violence took on an economic characteristic, as Augusto Pinochet and his civilian accomplices introduced neoliberal economic policies which cut welfare spending for impoverished Chileans. Cada temporarily fulfilled the role that the state had by giving out free milk in this poor neighbourhood of Santiago. They asked that the milk containers, these plastic bags commonly used to sell milk in Latin America, be returned, and artists were invited to intervene in these objects, hence the writing. The plastic bags became found objects that were then shown at the National Fine Art Museum in central Santiago de Chile, alongside videos of the group distributing the milk. Cada would also drive Suprole trucks outside the Fine Art Museum in central Santiago and place a white sheet outside the museum, as if to gesture towards taking the artwork outside of the museum walls. Cada were able to circumvent censorship in dictatorship Chile at the time by suggesting that they are engaged in art and not politics. 2. A woman is on an empty highway. She has a roll of white paper and glue in her hands. She approaches the central line of the road. She uses the white roll and starts to make a cross on the road, using the existing line of the carriageway as a found material. She adds another accompanying line across the already existing one. What was a single line akin to a minus sign in maths is transformed into a plus. Behind the woman, another 10 of these markings are in the road. This is Lottie Rosenfeld, a central member of Cada, making her work Una milla de cruces sobre el pavimento, a mile of crosses on the tarmac. This work, made in 1979, was a form of performance, but also land art. Rosenfeld would go on to make more of these plus signs on streets in Chile and eventually in other parts of the world. Her simple gesture transformed the ordinary street sign into an artwork. The plus sign would go on to take renewed importance in the fight against the dictatorship in Chile. 3. A group of 6 people approach a bridge in central Santiago de Chile. Below the bridge is the Rio Mapocho, the Mapocho River that traverses central Santiago. It is 1983. In the preceding years, dead bodies had been found floating in this river, victims of the dictatorship's clandestine violence. The river is the site of crimes committed by the state. The group of people, including women and men, approach the edge of the bridge holding rolled-up banners. They begin to unfurl the banners so that the onlooking public can see words appear from left to right. First, the word no. Second, a plus sign. Finally, a silhouette of a hand holding a gun. The code is simple. No, and a plus sign. No más, no more, and a gun. Violence. No more violence. This banner was then left on the bridge and was soon taken down by the Chilean police. The suggestion of no violence was too much for the repressive regime. This sign, the no más, no more, would reappear in 1988. Chile's brutal, power-hungry dictator, Augusto Pinochet, had called a plebiscite and allowed a small amount of freedom for Chile to decide on whether he should remain in power after mass mobilizations had called for an end to the dictatorship. The question was simple: yes to more years of Pinochet's rule, or no for a restoration of democracy. The no más sign came to symbolise the mark that individuals would have to make on the ballot paper. Chileans voting in the plebiscite would have to place a cross on the no part of the ballot paper if they wanted a return to democracy and an end to dictatorship. No más signs, no more signs, appeared at demonstrations with words such as miedo, fear, no more fear. Another sign had no más tortura, no more torture. And finally, no más dictadura, no more dictatorship. The No campaign had a memorable campaign song called La alegría ya viene. Happiness is coming, asking Chileans to vote no in this plebiscite. Chileans would make enough of these crosses on the ballot paper to bring an end to Pinochet's direct rule in Chile, even if in the process of the transition, Pinochet would make himself senator for life and continue to be a figure looming over Chilean politics until his death in 2006. The No Más sign has continued to this day. When protesters during the Estallido Social, the social uprising of 2019, called for an end to inequality and for a change of the constitution enacted during the dictatorship, people held up signs saying "No más AFP," no more to Chile's unfair pension system. Or when the Chilean police started to repress protesters, people once again held up "No más dictadura" to say no more violence, as the violence that the democratic government was using to squash protests echoed the dictatorship's violence. After 2 failed referenda, Chile would maintain its so-called Pinochet constitution. Cada and also Lottie Rosenfeld's No More sign continues to be a rallying cry against inequality and violence in Chile. Art speaks to politics, and artists have a role to play in political change. The milk container on Chile's Memory Museum's website attests to Cada's pivotal role in Chile's democratic transition. Protests in Chile are still met with police violence, and once again Chileans ask for no más, no more. Thank you for listening today. If you'd like to find out more about Cada and these objects of resistance, as well as many others, then please visit Chile's Memory Museum's website at www.mmdh.cl. Thanks for listening.